So let's go on. I wanted to read a little section of your book for you. And this is depending on which version that you have, 339, 340, it's around that area in everybody's book, I think. So dopamine plays an important role in the anticipation of pleasure and in energizing you in order to respond to incentives. Without the dopamine, you're not going to respond to the incentives. However, it can't be the whole story of pleasure, reward, and anticipation. As I said, for example, in your book, rats can still respond to reward to some extent, even when artificially depleted of dopamine in those pathways. Opioids probably play a role in the other pathways involved. Moreover, the dopamine pathway might be most relevant to spiky, intense variations of anticipation. A recent and fascinating study shows us. Get some college students who are in what they believe to be their one true love relationship. Put them in a scanner and flash up various familiar but neutral faces. Somewhere along the way, flash up a picture of the student's beloved. For people who were in the first few months of the relationship, the dopamine pathways lit up. For people whose relationship was more on the order of years, that's not what happened. Instead, there was activation of the anterior cingulate, that part of the brain discussed in the chapter on depression. The tegmentum accumbens dopamine system seems to be about the edgy, make you crazy with anticipation, passion. 2 years later, it's the cingulate weighing in, mediating something akin perhaps to comfort and warmth, or maybe even a non-hyperventilating version of love, and that is per Sapolsky. So going back to our PowerPoint, I need to get us here. Apologize for this. So stress and reward. You know how every time we have this kind a lecture and we first start with the actual thing we're talking about, right? The concept. In this case, reward, pleasure, the dopamine response. So now, as in the other lectures, we move on to what role does stress play? An element of surprise and lack of control actually fuels dopamine release and makes us feel good. It depends, however, again, a modulating factor, on whether the uncertainty occurs in a benign or malevolent context. In a context where it doesn't seem like it's dangerous or it can be harmful to you in any way, or in a context where it seems like it could be harmful, malevolent. Are you going to get shocked or get something really nice, in other words, is the question. As an example, Las Vegas and the gambling casinos and other casinos really have used this particular concept and behavioral response of humans for their benefit. I hate to break it to people, but guess what? It's not for your benefit, it's for their benefit. People are literally manipulated into thinking that the environment is benign. The outcome is likely to be a good one, maybe even a fantastic, absolutely over the top outcome, rather than malevolent. In other words, you're gonna win money, at least a little, if not a lot, but you're not going to lose money. You're not going to go home sad. And so because of that, people will be willing to keep, I don't gamble, I just don't gamble, but to do whatever they're doing there to earn money, to win money, because you're really not earning it. Okay. It also depends on how long the experience goes on. How long are you in this situation where you are consistently surprised and you lack control, which is fueling dopamine release? If it goes on too long, guess what? That reward sense starts to go away. The feeling that it's fun starts to dissipate. And for example, let's say you're accustomed to a roller coaster and it's one of the crazy ones that go upside down a million times and take short, quick turns and things like that. I don't need anything that much. Put me on just a regular ballpark type of idea roller coaster, and that's good enough for me. But if you are accustomed to one particular roller coaster and all of a sudden, while you didn't know this was happening, they added a whole section to it that was even scary and long. After a while, it's like, whoa, wait a minute. It's been like 20 minutes now, and this is getting the reward, the enjoyment starts to dissipate. Also, another factor is this experience in which you are surprised and lack control packaged in a larger net of safety? Is, in other words, a movie, okay? You can go in and you're experiencing what you see on the screen, but you know you're not in the screen. You know you're not in that circumstance. You are in with a group of people separate from that circumstance. That's your net of safety. Bungee jumping, jumping off head first from anything is stressful or fun, depending on who you are. And if you feel that you are being protected by the way the bungee jumping is occurring, you will have that reward from the stress, but it won't be overwhelming to you unless you're me. And dog playing, there's an example in your book about dogs playing, and is there a larger net of safety in that? And it can even get down to something like if dogs know one another, and this is a little different from what's in your book, but if dogs know one another and they read each other cues and they're in an area that they're comfortable with and they know, they can play, do the play fighting, if you will, but not feel threatened by the other dog. If you take them out of that context and they come across one another in a situation, if either one of them is not comfortable, does not feel like they're in this zone, that can totally change the outcome. Now, we're talking about stress, right? Okay, here's a surprise, talking about surprise and reward. Glucocorticoids actually triggered the release of dopamine in pleasure pathways. It's best when it is a moderate rise and doesn't go on too long. Severe and prolonged glucocorticoid exposure leads to, again, you know this, dysphoria, feeling not good, and depression. So we don't want it to go on for too long. Transient activation of the amygdala, both of them, either or, releases dopamine too. So just even transient, just here and there, and quickly resolving, if you will. You have an increase in glucocorticoids. Glucose and oxygen delivery increases. This delivery is going to different areas of your brain and periphery. All of these lead to the feeling of stimulation. Okay, so let's go on to adrenaline junkies. Now, this is not necessarily a drug abuser. It is the idea of somebody who likes to take risks, risky behavior, who likes to do very exciting things because they're not sure what the outcome will be. And in fact, there's a bit of danger associated with it. There are hypotheses as to why some people are like this and others are not. I'm pretty sure that if you sit and think about it, you know people in both categories. You may be one of these individuals who seek out opportunities to take scary risks. You may be among the individuals who is like, you know, this is a kind of fun. I'll do a little of this, but I'm pretty sure it's safe, so it's not that big of a risk. Anyway, hypotheses that exist include things like individuals who are risk takers release low amounts of dopamine normally, or receptors are less responsive than they should be, or baseline signaling is fine, but the individual gets bigger anticipatory signals than most other people. Remember that appetitive stage, remember the anticipatory part, those signals, there's more dopamine release, more, okay? And so it's like, wow, let's try that again. So at the end of a stimulating increase in dopamine, the release actually of the level of release, because you've had this increase in release, now drops below baseline. And it just doesn't go back to baseline where it should be. It goes below baseline. And so that leads to not feeling real good, right? It's like, oh man, I don't have much more to be. I need, you know, that'll, oh, this is not making me feel like anymore. You're below baseline. So to get rid of the dysphoria that results, you need an even bigger peak. Uh-oh, this should be a signal that we got a problem coming. And indeed we do. Addiction can result from what we just talked about. Many substances have addictive potential, but the commonality seems to be the ability to cause, it's supposed to say cause, not cause, sorry about that. I can't change, it's PowerPoint, I'll be a pain. The release of dopamine in the VTA, nucleus accumbens pathway. So that is the common feature of addiction to any substance. The difference is not all substances lead to the release of dopamine in this to the same extent. Furthermore, your subjective evaluation of how pleasurable something is makes a difference in how much that pathway is activated. If you evaluate something as being, whoa, really pleasurable, you're going to have increased activation of the pathway, which then is going to lead to, look at number 2, habituation or tolerance. Because now you're going down below baseline, remember? Okay, and that means you need increasing amounts of that addictive substance or whatever you're doing that is addictive, that could potentially be addictive. You need more of that to get the same anticipatory rush. For example, if baseline, oops, this is where I've got to get a whiteboard, that's all there is to it. If this is baseline, this level right here, and you have dopamine that goes up, but then when it comes back because of this circumstance, it goes way down here. Well, to get back up to here, you've added that much distance, right? Okay, so now you need more of that substance experience to get you up to the same point. Now, most rewarding activities, and I'm being very general with that, increase dopamine levels by 50 to 100%. However, cocaine increases dopamine by 1,000 times. 1,000 times. That means it doesn't take long for you need a whole lot more to get you to the same place. And why does this happen besides this level below baseline? Because this tidal wave, it is a tidal wave, results in a compensatory decrease in sensitivity. In other words, it's one of those deals. Oh my gosh, look how much we have out here. Look at how much dopamine we have here. This is so much. We do not need to be so sensitive, because if we continue with the sensitivity level, who knows what will happen. See, this is how intelligent your receptors are. The next time it's going to take even more dopamine release to impact those neurons, because they've decided they're going to cover their ears a little bit. They're not going to listen too much. They're going to not respond as much because their sensitivity has gone down. Now, there is a transitional time. The first part is addiction is about wanting the drug because you are anticipating its effects. You want the drug because you're like, oh, I know when I do this, I know when I take this, I'm going to feel awesome. And that provides motivation to get the reward of a drug. However, this changes. And looking above at the different steps that I just went through, you need the drug. Later, you need the drug. Because dopamine levels are so low without it, it is no longer about how good it feels. It's about how bad it feels when you don't have the drug. Hence, addiction. Now, there are other factors that really play into the strength of this addictive process and maintenance, okay? The psychological context in which you find yourself when you're experiencing the pleasure, the reward associated with the substance of interest here, or activity of interest, become cues that last forever. We have wonderful things with our brains. We have the ability to remember things. We have the ability to have things stay in our mind and brain so that, one, we can avoid danger in the future. For example, let's go to very basic evolutionary principles. Survival, okay? This is wonderful. Or those things that make you feel good. You recall them and it's like, oh, yes, that, However, on the other side, we have these cues that will last forever that will promote relapse. This is referred to as context-dependent relapse. It is the result of a type of learning. And it's because during this, you have potentiation. Remember, strengthening long-term potentiation of synapses between the cortex and those hippocampal regions that are important for LTP, long-term potentiation, and dopamine neurons. So let's say that every time you went to this particular place, every time you went there, you engaged in some kind of behavior that would lead to addiction. You go back to that place, guess what? Even if you have broken free from that addiction, you go back there, that cue will start agitating those same circuits until you relapse to try to get that same feeling. Okay, so what about stress and substance abuse? Okay, stress, how does that impact your potential, if you will, for abusing substances? Drugs of abuse, generally speaking, and I am going to say generally speaking, tend to make you feel less stressed. Now, interestingly, if a stressor occurs after the drug's effects have kicked in, then the drug can make you feel less stressed. Wait a minute though, because in a minute we're going to see where that it makes a difference whether the stressor occurs before or after the drug's effects have kicked in. For example, alcohol. If you have consumed enough alcohol that it has blunted the stress response, and then a stressor occurs, that will help you feel less stressed. However, and besides that, remember how I said, interestingly enough, glucocorticoids in certain circumstances can actually make you feel a little better, but that's short-lived. With more sustained use, some drugs can blunt the mechanics of the stress response. So eventually you can decrease sympathetic nervous system activation. You can dampen CRH mediated activity. Remember, corticotropin releasing hormone that comes from the hypothalamus and is released into the anterior pituitary. And when this is happening, it changes your cognitive appraisal of a stressor. You don't perceive that stressor to be all that bad. However, as blood levels drop, the effects of that drug, no matter what it is, wears off, cognition and reality are back, and now you've got anxiety. So stress then continues to push you towards more drug use and then more relapse. I put in here, not sure how, because that's kind of what Sapolsky put in the book. However, there are many, many putative theories coming up now. And again, because I don't have time in this particular course to go through them all, I'm being very minimalistic, if you will, on this particular concept. It can depend on the individual, obviously, the drug that's being used, the types of stressors being experienced, the person's initial appraisal of the stressor. So from what I have seen recently, and from logically, I'm thinking that it depends on how all these factors play a role that determines why stress pushes you towards more drug use and relapse. I know that's kind of a capsule of information, but again, I wish I had more time with this course, but I don't. That's for another course. And there are studies being carried out that are really pointing us more and more to certain directions. Okay, effects of stress on that initial addiction process. If a rat processes Levorex a number of times, and then is infused with an addictive drug, second step, we're going to stress that rat just before the session. That rat is more likely to administer to the point of addiction. So this is really, really important information, because that means one of the worst things you can probably do to avoid addiction is not use an addictive drug in response to a stressor. This flies in the face of much of the behavior in our culture. Unpredictable stress seems to have a greater effect on the addiction process than predictable stress. That should hopefully by now come as absolutely no surprise to you, because we know that predictability modulates the perception and the effect of stress. Stress increases, now listen, however, the addictive potential of a drug only if the stressor comes right before the drug exposure. So here we go. experience a stressor, whatever. Maybe a huge fight with somebody. Maybe you had a horrible exam, and you know that you did really poorly on it. Stress, right? Right? Okay. Go. You consume some kind of addictive substance. Guess what? That will make it more likely that you will develop an addiction to that. Short-term or acute stress that boosts dopamine levels transiently act like a booster shot, okay, if you will. Stress increases the likelihood of administering a drug to addiction when stress is experienced. I was doing one of my Putnam words, experienced. That's stress and experience put together. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Others who, if this is your first course with me, are not quite sure. But I have a tendency when I get excited about what I'm doing, particular talking about and teaching, that I tend to develop a shorthand verbally, in which I'll take the first part of one word and then the last part of the word that follows it, put it together and develop one word out of two. And lots of times it's understandable. And this is a digression, but maybe a digression right now might be a little bit good. Back when I was at UB teaching, I was teaching a biopsychology of reproduction course. And I was talking about internal genitalia, the development of internal genitalia and external genitalia. And I went through an entire semester, entire class, saying internalia and externalia. Get it? Intergenitalia, external genitalia. I never heard myself. At the end of that class, a student came up with his notes and said, I just want to make sure this is the term you want us to use and in terms of this process. So I looked at it and I'm like, oh my gosh, did I say that? He goes, yeah. I go, did you know what I meant? He goes, yeah. And I'm like, but no, that's not the right term. So I had to correct. I'm like, oh gosh. The interesting thing to me was not one person questioned it. Anyhow, as I said, a little side story. Go away, you. See, this is what happens when I tell a little side story. So stress increases the likelihood of administering a drug to addiction when stress is experienced during childhood and as a fetus. This has been demonstrated with the rat studies. Again, a reminder, the rats who are deprived of oxygen during birth have like stress, obviously, and that can increase the likelihood of administering a drug to addiction. And again, in my 398 class, when I talk about neurobiology of childhood mental disorders, we do actually talk about this to a great extent. The important thing here, though, is something long-term has to be happening, not just a transient release of dopamine. Whoa, dopamine, okay. No, perinatal experiences cause lifelong programming of brain and body. The acknowledgement of that, the evidence of that we have today is what prompted me to develop a sequel to my 397 course, in which I really focused a lot of attention on this. Okay, what else increases? How does stress continue to increase or change abuse tendencies? Ongoing stress increases abuse. Stress increases relapse. And we're going to talk about rats here, which rats are most likely to self-administer to the point of addiction. And assuming that we can take what we learned from the rats and apply to the human. High reactors. Oh my goodness. Do you remember the psychological variables? Hot responders, high reactors, not always angry, but overreacting to things. Those individuals who are high reactors, those individuals who for some reason physiologically secrete glucocorticoids longer in response to a stressor. So that is kind of the summation. Like, so there are differences in addictive potential to some degree. Context is important. When stress occurs in relationship to the consumption of an addictive substance makes a difference. And who you are as a personality can make a difference in addictive potential. But stress clearly plays a role. So hopefully that makes sense. Make sure you keep track of the ideas of the dopamine release for reward and motivation, that particular circuit in the brain that plays the important role, the role in this process, and also why do we end up with habituation or tolerance. Remember the concept of intermittent reinforcement. That's also a very important concept in any realm of life, okay? So that concludes this lecture. I'll see you again soon.